I'm Skylar with Lean Frontiers. So, real quick from me, you will receive a link to view this recording within 24 to 48 hours. That does come directly from my email. On our screen, you can see Jim and Mark. And it looks like, Jim, we do have a couple of people still falling in, but I
All
know
right.
it's right at 2 o'clock. So, if you're ready to start, go right ahead.
Yep, we'll get rolling. All right. Well, hello everyone. Welcome to this fireside chat with Mark Warren, Toyota's adoption of TWI, successful application of TWI skills. Now, introduce Mark here. I'm not going to go through this whole bio. We kind of posted that with the webinar, but just a little bit with Mark to kind of lead into it is, Mark's been working on a lot of lean projects actually since the late 70s. So a number of years doing that in various engineering and management positions. And then after that, started consulting actually in the early 2000s. But Mark's also known as a historian, but I want to couch that a bit, especially on TWI and lean and other things. Really, Mark's background, his experience is really the most dramatic thing with Mark. And his dive into the history was really his kind of one of the ways he would go get the facts. So to really understand what was going on historically, why people did what they did, what their particular challenges were, in order to understand as he applied this, leading implementations and helping execute organizations through this process to really giving that better understanding, again, with that background to make his operational implementation, which is where his real experience is with that. So with that, Mark, we'll kind of let you kind of take
Yeah.
over from here, but I want people to have that understanding of the tie-in of history with your experience.
Well, thanks, Jim. I'm kind of glad that you've opened it up like this because I think my history focus tends to overshadow what I've done out in the factories. And maybe a little bit of background. Some of what drove some of my research even deeper into TWI and Toyota especially came from a conversation maybe 20 odd years ago with John Shook. And what was supposed to be a short conversation turned into about a half a day. And of course, us old guys sitting around telling war stories and our experiences about lean and TWI. The piece that we looked at is, there's thousands and thousands of companies that did the TWI programs, but very few had success at the level of what Toyota did. And so we ended the conversation with, so what did Ono do differently? And that's been a bit of the focus of my research and experiments the last 20 odd years. And to some degree, we can sum it up a little bit. So I don't know where you want me to start. Would you like me to put up
Yeah.
some illustrations?
Yeah,
Let's see.
kind of maybe go through some of, remember the conversations you and I have had of,
Yeah.
that TWI is much more than just a training program. So maybe that and how that expands out.
Yeah. Okay. So it is more than a training program. And for most of the people that have taken any of the TWI courses, they might remember the 5 needs of the supervisor, and we tend to concentrate on the J programs. But we tend to overshadow and forget about the knowledge of responsibilities. And this is one of the things I think that set Toyota off from everybody else is their top management went through all of the J programs and then said, maybe that's not going to be enough. And so they went through also the MTP program, and the very first session.
What thing, maybe, hey, Mark, you may explain to him what the NTP program is, what it's
Okay.
an acronym for, and
Okay.
a little bit about it.
So MTP is Management Training Program. So if you've gone through a JI program, hey, I can do it in a week. It's 2 hours a day, 5 days in a week. MTP is a little bit different. It's almost like a little mini MBA on a weekend. So it had 22 classes. And so you'd go every Saturday. And this is about how to be a good manager and actually how to use the programs. So it's kind of an execution side. And so you can imagine if you took your whole top team of managers, supervisors, C-suite through, this is where, you would get everybody on board. Either you see value in the program or you don't.
Yeah. One thing too, out here, just because some people may not know all this, these were actually executed and delivered during World War or post World War II during the occupation.
Yep. So yeah. So this was about 1951, 52. This is also in a time when Toyota was under a lot of pressure. They had financial problems. They had a lot of labor problems. But and they were actually doing almost a cultural change. So the interesting piece is when I stumbled onto this is I look back and the TWI service during the war about midway through realized there was a very different gap between some companies that used it had wild success with it, others had just marginal success. And they started researching and they realized that the ones that had the best success started with the top management taking the programs. So there's sort of a top-down piece. So management has to understand what the programs do beyond just a training program. So you buy into it, you get your pocket cards, and you start actually actively behaving and following the patterns. So there's actually kind of a cultural change that happens. And so this execution or the application side is a leading by example. And this is where we see the significant changes are. On top of that, Toyota actually had to incorporate these programs into their needs. So if top management sets their objectives and you really have clear objectives of like, okay, so I think it's going to be useful. And you say, okay, how is it going to be useful? And you want to have in the pilot program, you want to have some immediate improvement, some immediate response, or some immediate sort of payback for buy-in, that sort of thing. So let's see how it do.
Yeah, with you saying that, I mean, that's one thing. They certainly, as they were developed during World War II and utilized in the States, training programs was something Toyota really realized is as much as they were training programs, they're actually skills and behavioral patterns that really can and should transcend the organization.
Right. So I've got this little slide about it's kind of a ripple effect. So they learn the patterns, and then you have to, inside the interesting part, inside each of the program, there's some actual activities that you have to do to apply them and use them. And as you begin to use them on a regular basis, it becomes a habit. And then eventually these habits become unconscious and get to be behaviors. And then when we have kind of a tipping point of enough of management following that, we see the culture. And today, this is where everybody has studied the katas that Toyota does, which is all of them are hidden back into their original TWI programs.
Yeah, and actually, you and I talked about this a little bit,
Yeah.
Mark. As Mike Rother he was doing the research. Would end up being his book Toyota Kata. He was essentially observing these different patterns in a variety of organizations.
Yep. So if I go back to the management training program, there were 22 programs. And in the very first session, they basically said, okay, here's how the sessions are going to run. Here's how we want you to participate, et cetera, et cetera. And then they got into, hey, very first lesson, I want you to learn to be a leader and not a boss. So it's really straightforward. And they set up the responsibilities of a supervisor. And you have a management list here. You've got the JI, here's the JM, and here's the JR piece. And so it was very predictable, sequential way of doing things.
Hey, one thing on that, Mark, I've noticed if you look at as they implemented this post-war during the occupation in Japan, Japan just by its culture historically for centuries is a very hierarchical type of culture. So this is a pretty good hurdle for Toyota to get themselves over and through.
Yep. So I have seen companies change, but most of them change because they have a major need. Somebody at the top, the CEO, COO level, realize that the company is not going to survive in the next decade or so unless they make some significant changes. And so they start trying to get their managers and supervisors to follow these patterns.
Hey, Mark, one thing real quick. Somebody asked, can you zoom in on that a little bit? On the screen, it's a little bit difficult to see all that.
Well, this one, yeah. So the specific responsibilities are right in here. I can send people copies of this if they like. So for me, this is the big piece. And to give you an idea of how this is carried over, David Meyer, who was one of the early managers hired at the Toyota plant in Kentucky, and he's an author of the Toyota Way Field book, has a series of pages where they actually define what the team leader's responsibilities are, expectations. They define what the team manager's responsibilities are. So that would be like 70 years later when that was written. So it did come in, and if you're not going to do it at the top, I have examples of where you have somebody in a middle-level management position that has implemented the TWI programs and lean, but when they leave, management changes and it's not embedded in the culture. It has to be from the top. And so I think in our discussion earlier, we had talked about both Eiji Toyota and Teiichi Ono. Eiji had gone to the River Rouge and had seen all of what was going on there. And he had an edict from his father to catch up to Ford within 3 years. They said it took them about 5. From a productivity standpoint, it took about 10 Toyota employees to do what one was doing at Ford. And Ono had recognized or had seen the company set up for flow back in the 30s and was struggling to, get it done. And they had the just-in-time idea years earlier, but could not put it into place.
Yeah.
And
hey, Mark, would you say a couple of their challenges were really to try to implement flow? Certainly
Yep.
one, and then the fact they were financially struggling. So how do they accomplish this with those two big challenges in front of them?
Okay. Let me go back to. So they actually, the other trap I see is people go and they learn JI or JI and JR, and they use it vertically. And I still don't understand how these guys, and I think it may be because of the MTP program, but I'm still playing with understanding how did they make the jump from doing this vertically to seeing this as an integrated system? So they actually went out, and you can look at your process flow, your sequence, and look at all your barriers and snags, your problems. And that's with JM, it picks up. And then I use JR as a fact-finding piece. It's not about the people problems. It's about problem solving and getting the facts, learning how to experiment. And once I can do that, then I define a one best way. And there's a lot of information showing that they were reading a lot of both Mogensen and others.
Probably what Frederick Taylor and the Gilbreths also.
Yeah,
Maybe?
it's mostly Gilbreth. Shingo kind of disparagingly calls Taylor as he was just a guy with a stopwatch. But he said the real shift came when they began to think about work differently. And Gilbreth probably was the biggest driver for setting the one best way. And once you document that, you create a way that you want to do the work. And if it doesn't come out, then I switch back and go into fact-finding mode and try to understand why. Did I miss a key point? Am I missing a step in my instruction? Is it not capable? Then I go back to JM to improve it. It's just a circular, and this is where the continuous improvement piece came in.
Yeah, kind of a circular cycle of continuous improvement. You mentioned Mogensen, maybe a little bit about on him, Alan Mogensen, who was an industrial engineer who actually worked with the Gilbreths.
Yep.
And he was actually behind the development of the JM program during the war.
Yep. Yeah, there's a lot of interesting stories behind that. And so JM is actually kind of a industrial engineering light. It's industrial engineering in the very beginning phase with all the engineering nomenclature removed. And so it didn't take, it was probably the program absorbed most rapidly into Toyota. They absorbed it and basically exhausted it by within 5 years. It couldn't get any further. So then they brought in Shingo to begin to teach the industrial engineering piece. But so for me, that's the bottom line of what I have seen is you have to get management buy-in. And the buy-in has to be, you have to give people, management has to give the managers and the supervisors time to practice and learn these skills and permission to experiment and make mistakes. It is truly a learning piece. And so if you look at Toyota's original manual, Ono writes about a lot of their explorations and trying to get in and trying to learn and apply this sort of thing.
And one thing actually, Mark, it's David Veach, your friend David Veach asked, have you seen many organizations who have tried to implement TWI and JI in particular without working through the one best way piece?
Yes. And the biggest trap that I see is people take the JI program and they go and they try to get as many processes documented and job breakdowns done on it, and then a training matrix, and then that kind of dies. And that's the one without the one best way. The most proficient application I have seen is you go in, you map the sequences, and then you do what we call a heat map. Where are the problem areas? Those are the ones that we document. And basically, you document the way you do it today, and if it's not good enough, we start trying to improve it.
As I mentioned, we actually have been doing a TWI meetup virtually we do that between the summits, TWI summit one year to the next. And we just had one this week, and that's exactly one of the problems. Some of them on there said they had experienced. They were trying to do all the job breakdowns, the jibs, and doing
Yeah.
that versus really what is the problem they really need to solve instead of just trying to get a bunch of those done.
Yep. So, and what we find is you can look in any kind of larger job picture, and inside that job, there are usually 10 to 20 skills, job breakdown sheets that need to be done to make that person functional in the piece. And so rather than the 100 or 200 possible job breakdowns you can do, I think people get mired up in trying to get so many job breakdowns. And when I focus on teaching the thinking process of, okay, I'm going to use it to learn observation. I'm going to use the, instead of a skills matrix, the timetable was actually kind of a learning to see problems, learning to identify them strategically. What am I going to do about it? So, what I've used in the last few years, JI, is very, very different than how most people apply it who only do the 10-hour program. So you have some more questions?
Dave Veach just commented. He goes, "I think too many," which you can maybe elaborate on this. Too many people confuse job breakdowns with standardized work.
Oh, good. I'm glad he asked that. So a job breakdown is just the very beginning of standardized work. It's just like, I have a concept of here's how we want the job to do. To get to standard work, that job has to be, basically, if I follow the instructions, I have 100% perfect outcome.
Yeah, one
I
thing
begin,
I can say on that, Mark, is really the job breakdown really might be that the aspect of go and observe, go and understand, go find the facts. In a way, it's a methodology for that.
well, but it's more than that. But standard work, when you get to that, you've actually probably gone through 8 or 10 iterations of that job breakdown to optimize it. You've actually looked at the time, the exact sequence, the best times. You start optimizing the layout. You know how much buffer stock is needed for doing the Kanbans. You have actually synchronize this process with an upstream or downstream process. There is a tremendous amount of work that goes in to truly getting standard work. And I can't tell you how many factories I've gone in who think they have standard work, and I have yet to see any of them truly have standard work. So,
Ditto from David Veach.
so, I mean, I've got a lot of slides I would prefer. And I mean, I could go, like, I could go on and on for hours about the Toyota TWI kind of thing.
Yeah, maybe you could, like I said, you and I were talking about this the other day. Elaborate more on, because you started talking about this at the beginning. Again, these are skills, and a lot of times with what we're talking about, the standard work, it's talking about the process level and all that. Maybe talk through how these same skills, these things, and even Toy did, they transcend up into more than just the process and things like that on the shop floor, but a lot of other management practices.
Okay, so I guess in the very first stages, I try to get the supervisors. I want them to be aware that they're trying to create flow. So I have to integrate TWI skills into the larger picture of what you're trying to do. I've got to integrate it into the objectives. They always have to see something tangible in the first week. So we usually pick an assembly line or a machining line or some production process that's problematic and go out and walk through, and we do the observation piece. I mean, Ono is famous for drawing his circle on the floor and getting people to observe. But a lot of that observation skill can be developed by trying to create the job breakdown. Now, once you do that, immediately you see, hey, I could improve this process. So it's like, okay, everybody wants to jump to conclusions. And I'm like, no, we really don't have enough facts. We don't understand it. So you try to get the supervisors and managers in the habit of like, before I jump to a conclusion, do I have all the facts? Have I actually gone out and put my hands on it or seen it, observed it? Can I truly quantify it? And that's the piece that I go. And I think you're talking about this slide.
And I would say too, that some of that would be just to go out and talking with people, whether it's the supervisors, foremen, operators, setup, and so forth. Just to what else have you not observed or noticed or saw?
Yeah. So, ironically, you go into companies and people say, "Oh, they really understand the process," but when we go out there and actually look at the sequence of operations and how a problem at say a station downstream, if you start peeling back the layers, it has its source back upstream, or it has its source in management. One of the interesting experiments we carried out about 10 years ago in a group of companies that we were teaching all three programs, and the two companies could be just like night and day. One had about, I don't know, 2,500, 3,000 employees. The other one had about 600. One was they were trying to change their structure from very, very strict boss, rule. And the other one's more family structure. Well, we gave all the supervisors and managers an assignment one night. Give them a piece of paper, draw 3 columns. On one column, what problems do you have that you can fix with JI? On the other column, what problems can you fix with JM, the process? And in the middle, you can list the JR problems. Both groups struggled to put more than a couple of ideas on the JI and JM columns. Everybody had their JR people problems, just, So we looked through and we had very common complaints. And so we said, okay, we pick out that common people problem and started using 5 whys. We peeled back the layers, and every one that they had of a general problem came back to one. They have a crappy process that they had ignored long enough for people to get irritated that you created a personality conflict. Same thing. Oh, you hadn't clearly defined your expectations, hadn't clearly defined how to do the job right. So we found no people problems that were really people problems. They were all management owned the 100%. And that's really kind of an epiphany for the people in the room, that all of it was management issues. And so if I get back to Toyota and this success, is Toyota realized they own the responsibility for creating good processes where all their employees can be successful.
Yeah, Mark, with that, somebody, actually, Robert Brooks asked this question, and actually we're almost at our target time. Like I mentioned to you yesterday, we're going to fly through this. I'll ask this one last question, and we may have to do a part 2 to this just because there's definitely more to talk about. But he asked, traditionally, who or which department owns the different procedures? Like, is JI and quality, JM the lean leaders, JR HR, human side? Is there some?
Okay. Recipe for disaster is give it to the training department or HR. And actually, the original founders of TWI actually had some same stories they told companies. If you hand it off to the human resources department, this program will fail. So production has to own all 3. So it's basically COO, production operation. And so, and if I go back to Shingo a little bit, quality, you're just an auditor. You're just verifying that production meets the expectations of what the standards are. And Shingo talked about that the quality piece was just writing obituaries for all the failures. So operations has to own it.
Okay, good. Well, we're actually about to our target time, and like I said, there's a lot more that we can go into. And I mean, if you're willing, Mark, we can certainly do a part two to this, because there's even in just kind of some of the takeaways, there's even definitely some significant expansions on some of the bullets that we'd sent out to go through. Like I said, when we were talking yesterday, that we're going to fly through the 30 minutes pretty quick. And even if we get on here again to carry on further, we'll fly through another 30 minutes pretty quick as well.
Okay. And I'm open to answering questions. You're welcome to share my email. And I can say I have an experiment I did with a company overseas. It was already lean when I came there. And inside 5 years, in the same footprint and with about 10% more people, they now produce 10 times as much product.
Yeah.
So it works.
It can work very well.
All right. Very well. Yes. And thanks everybody for attending.
Yeah. Thank you, everybody. Thank you, Mark. And yeah, we will look to schedule, and somebody put in here, thanks. We need a part 2 and 3, but we'll certainly look to doing a part 2 at a minimum. So thank you, everybody. And Skylar, I'll hand it back over to you to close out.
Thank you to everybody who attended today's webinar or fireside chat with Jim and Mark. Just a quick reminder, you will receive a link from me within 24 to 48 hours. Also, the TWI and Kata Summit is coming up in April, so just be on the lookout. We have been sharing stuff about the agenda and that kind of thing. And if we are doing a part 2, you will find out about that as well. Everybody, have a great day. We'll see you soon.